The carriage pulled through the gates of Ashmore Park on a Tuesday in late October, and Harriet Carew, who had been the Countess of Ashmore for precisely 11 days, did not look out the window as they rolled beneath the copper beeches. She had looked out the window once, outside Kettering, when the driver had called down that they were an hour away. She had noted the color of the sky, which was a low, uniform gray, and the particular lean of the elms in the field beyond the road. And then she had returned her attention to the small notebook open on her knee, in which she was recording the mileage against what the coachman had told her at the last stage. The figures matched. She closed the notebook and tucked it into her traveling bag and smoothed her gloves, which were cream-kid and fit her hands precisely, because she had bought them herself. Edmund Carew rode alongside the carriage on a dark bay gelding. He had ridden the entire distance rather than sit across from her, which she had not taken as an insult. She had taken it as information. They had been introduced in September, when it was already understood that the marriage would happen. Harriet's father had died in July, and the estate's entail passed to a cousin who had made it clear, in the particular language of men with legal leverage and poor manners, that the Weston women had until Michaelmas. The cousin had offered to solve the problem by marrying Cecily. Cecily had declined with a precision Harriet recognized as her own, borrowed for the occasion. The solicitor, Mr. Dalton, had found Edmund Carew's situation instead. A widowed earl in need of a capable woman to manage a substantial household while he gave his attention to the land. The advertisement, in spirit, if not in letter, had been for a housekeeper with a title. Harriet had understood that, and had not resented it. Cecily had wept the night before the wedding, not from grief exactly, but from the guilt of watching her sister take a step that Cecily's own refusal had made necessary. Harriet had held her twin's hands and told her that it was not her fault, and had meant it, because Cecily was not made for practicality, and Harriet had always known this, and had long ago decided it was not a failing, only a kind of nature, the way some flowers could not manage frost. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. Harriet descended with her traveling bag in hand, because she had not waited for it to be taken, and stood on the gravel sweep of Ashmore Park and looked at the house with the same attention she had given the elms outside Kettering. It was large and well maintained, which told her the steward was competent, or had been recently. The western wing showed new pointing in the stonework. The kitchen garden wall, visible at the corner of the house, had been recently repaired. The topiary was slightly overgrown. She catalogued these things without expression. Edmund dismounted and handed the gelding to the groom and came to stand beside her. He was 34, she had learned from the solicitor. He was taller than she had remembered from their introduction. He looked at the house in the same way she did, without affection and without apology. "Your rooms are in the east wing," he said. "Mrs. Pringle will show you." He paused. "I hope the journey was tolerable." "The roads were good," she said. He nodded and went inside. The Dowager Countess of Ashmore received them in the drawing room, which was decorated in the style of 15 years prior and smelled of lavender and coal smoke. She was a handsome woman of 58 who had spent 30 years managing a household and knew precisely how to make another woman feel the weight of that knowledge without saying anything direct enough to be challenged. She took Harriet's measure in the second between greeting and handshake. Harriet took hers in the same second. Later that afternoon, while Harriet was being shown the linen rooms by Mrs. Pringle, she heard Lady Ashmore's voice through the half-open door of the small sitting room, speaking to a caller whose carriage Harriet had seen arrive from her window. "He has brought home the plain one," Lady Ashmore said. A pause in which a teacup was set down. One does what one can with what one is given. Harriet stood very still in the linen room. Mrs. Pringle, to her credit, looked at the window and said nothing. After a moment, Harriet turned to the next shelf and ran her finger along the edge of a folded sheet to check whether it had been laundered recently. It had. She made a note in the small notebook. If you have ever arrived somewhere knowing that the room had already decided who you were, you will understand what the next weeks felt like. Stay a little longer. Harriet was only just beginning. The household accounts were kept in a large red ledger that lived on the steward Pharaoh's desk. Harriet asked for it on her third morning at Ashmore because she had woken at 5 and found no occupation that did not feel like trespassing, and accounts were the one territory she could enter without permission from anyone living. She told Mrs. Pringle she was familiarizing herself with the household. Mrs. Pringle brought the ledger to her sitting room without comment. By 10 o'clock, Harriet had found 3 separate errors in the column additions of the past 6 months. 2 were minor. 1 was not. She did not say anything that morning. She set the ledger on the table beside her chair and made her own notations in pencil on a separate sheet of paper, working forward and backward from the discrepancy to locate its origin, and found it. A pattern, subtle and consistent, in the quarterly rents from the home farm tenancies. The amounts recorded by the bailiff, Greaves, were systematically lower than what the individual receipts showed when cross-referenced against the correspondence with Mr. Dalton's office. The difference across 2 years came to a little under £400. She put her pencil down. She picked it up again. She worked the calculation a second time and got the same figure. The ledger became her companion. She brought it to the library each morning and returned it to Pharaoh's desk each afternoon, and no one questioned this because no one looked at what she was doing closely enough to see that she was doing anything at all. She was the plain one, after all. She was new. She was quiet. She was the woman who sat beside the fire in the evenings after dinner while Edmund read and Lady Ashmore did needlework, and who spoke when spoken to and did not speak otherwise, and who had the habit, noticed eventually by Lady Ashmore, of rising early and going to bed late. Lady Ashmore attributed this to poor sleep. It was not poor sleep. Edmund spoke to her at dinner. He asked about the household management, whether she had found anything wanting, whether Mrs. Pringle was cooperative. These were questions asked from duty, and Harriet answered them from the same. She noticed, however, that his questions were specific. He did not ask whether she was settling in, or whether she was comfortable, or whether she missed her family. He asked whether the weekly accounts were being properly presented to her, and whether she had found the stable arrangement suitable, and whether she had looked at the kitchen garden because there was a drainage problem on the north side that Pharaoh had not been able to solve. She had, in fact, looked at the kitchen garden. She had a solution for the drainage problem. She told him, briefly. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was not quite any of the things she knew how to name, and then he said she should speak to the head gardener in the morning and that he would tell the man to do as she directed. She went to bed that night with the sense that something had shifted by a single degree, the way a compass needle settles after being moved. It was in the 4th week of her residence at Ashmore that Edmund came to the library in the morning and found her there. He had not expected anyone. She could tell this from the way he stopped in the doorway, one hand still on the frame. He was in riding clothes without his coat, and he had been out since before daylight. She had heard the stable sounds from her window, and his hair was still marked by the hat he had been wearing. He looked at her across the length of the room. She was at the large table under the north windows, the red ledger open before her, and beside it a sheet of foolscap on which she had been drafting, with considerable care, a letter to Mr. Dalton. The letter named the discrepancy. It named the calculation. It did not name Greaves directly, but it laid out the evidence in a logical sequence that any competent solicitor would follow to the same conclusion she had reached. She had been working on the letter for 3 mornings, and this draft was nearly right. "My lord," she said, because she had learned to speak first so that the pause never grew long enough to become awkward. He crossed the room. He did not ask what she was doing. He stopped at a distance of perhaps 6 feet and looked at the open ledger, and then at the sheet of foolscap, and read what was written there, or enough of it. And she watched his expression rather than looking away. He said nothing for a long moment. His jaw was set, and his eyes were moving across the page with the focused attention of a man who was not merely reading, but calculating. "How long?" he said. "The pattern is clear from 2 years past," she said. "Possibly longer. I would need the prior ledger to be certain." He looked up from the page. "You found this on your own. The column additions were incorrect," she said. "I began there." He looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. She held his gaze because she had learned, over a lifetime of being Cecily's shadow, that looking away was its own form of permission. "I will send for the prior ledger," he said, "and I will write to Dalton myself." "I had nearly finished the letter," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I read it." He paused. "Your argument is sound. Your language is precise. I would like to add my signature to it, if you are willing." She was willing. She did not say so with more words than were necessary. She turned back to the page and finished the sentence she had been in the middle of writing. And Edmund Carew remained in the library for another hour, reading the prior ledger that Pharaoh brought at his request. And the 2 of them did not speak again, but occupied the same room with a quality of silence that was different from the silence of strangers. He began to notice things about her that he had not been looking for. He noticed that she rose before 6 every morning, not from restlessness, but from preference. That she liked the house when it was quiet. That she could be found in the kitchen garden or the still room or the library with a quality of self-containment that was not coldness but competence. That she moved through the household as though she had already mapped every room and needed no guidance. He noticed that she spoke to the servants by name and without condescension, that she remembered what Mrs. Pringle had told her about the laundrywomen, and asked after the younger one who had been unwell. He noticed that she did not speak at dinner to fill silence, and that when she did speak, it was because she had something to say. He noticed that she never asked him for anything. This last observation settled in him in a way he could not immediately account for. His first wife, Arabella, had been brilliant at asking for things. She had done it with such grace that you did not realize until afterward that the asking had been a performance, calibrated to produce a specific response, and that your willingness to give was what she had been assessing. Harriet did not ask. She arranged. She solved. She placed results before him without preface, and if he thanked her, she received the thanks as information, not as reward. He began, without intending to arrange reasons to be in the same room. It was the drainage problem that produced the first of the command as protection moments. Though Harriet would not have called it that. She had gone to the kitchen garden in the early afternoon and was standing at the north wall, examining the lay of the ground, when the sky opened. Without warning. The rain in this part of the country had its own character, particular and sudden. And within 30 seconds she was thoroughly wet through her light wool spencer, and her half-boots were filling with mud. Edmund appeared from the direction of the stables at a fast walk, already pulling off his coat. "Come inside," he said. Not a question. She looked at the ground once more, because she had been measuring an angle with her eye, and then she turned and went with him. He put the coat over her shoulders without asking whether she wanted it. It was warm and smelled of leather and horse, and something she did not immediately name. She did not give it back until they reached the kitchen door. "I had nearly determined the drainage issue," she said. "I know," he said. "You were measuring the fall of the ground." She looked at him. "You were watching." "I was passing," he said. The distinction was technically accurate and practically false, and she could see from the slight movement at the corner of his mouth that he knew this. She thought about that small motion for the rest of the afternoon. There was a moment in the library 3 days after the rain when he came to return a volume to the shelf, and she was already there, and neither of them moved to allow the other through the narrow passage between the table and the shelves, and they stood for a breath too long, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corner of his eye and the way his breath steadied as he waited for her to step aside. She did not step aside immediately. She was not certain why. She was aware of him in a way that had no name in the vocabulary she had been given for her own experience, a warmth in her chest that she had not expected to find in this house, a physical certainty about exactly where he was in the room at every moment that she had learned to distrust because she had been taught not to expect. She stepped aside. He returned the volume. His hand brushed her wrist as he turned. Neither of them acknowledged it. He did not, she had decided, find her worth noting. He found her useful. She understood the distinction and had made her peace with it as best she could. She had not yet learned that these two things were not, in his experience, different. If you have stayed this long, you already know that Harriet did not expect to be chosen. That is the wound the world had given her. And it was precise, fitted to her, like the too tight gloves she had worn to the introduction in September. Stay. She did not know yet that Edmund Carew had a wound of his own, and that it was the mirror image of hers. It was the night of the first frost, with the fire in the library built up against the cold, and the windows showing a sky that had gone entirely clear and dark, when he told her about Arabella. He did not plan to tell her. He had come to the library to verify a figure in the estate accounts, and she had been there before him, and they had worked in companionable silence for an hour before she rose to replace the ledger on the shelf, and he said, without looking up from the page, "My first wife found me dull." Harriet turned. She said nothing, which was the right response, and Edmund Carew, who was not a man accustomed to speaking about himself, found that the silence was not demanding, and continued. "She was witty," he said. "Charming." The room was different when she entered it. I had found that quality dazzling when we were young. By the second year, I understood that the performance was the woman, and that there was nothing behind it waiting to be known. She did not dislike me. I was simply not very interesting to her. He paused. Harriet sat down again, not to stay, but to signal that she was not in a hurry to leave. "She died in November of our 3rd year," he said. "The child died with her." He turned a page of the ledger. He was not looking at the page. "I have a miniature. I keep it on my desk, face down. I could not have told you until very recently why I kept it at all." He turned to the desk. The small oval miniature was there, face down, as it always was, a tiny painted face Harriet had seen and not asked about, because she did not ask about things she had not been invited to know. "I decided," Edmund said, "that marriage was a country one passed through rather than lived in. That the most honest arrangement was one that required specific things from both parties and left the rest to each to manage alone." Harriet sat very still. She had spent enough of her life being managed that she recognized the description from the inside. "I think you made a reasonable decision with the information you had," she said. He looked at her. "I think," she continued, and she was choosing the words with the same care she gave to the letters she wrote to solicitors. That a bad first proof is not a proof of impossibility, only a proof that the first attempt was wrong. He said nothing for a long moment. The fire settled. Outside, the first frost was laying itself down on the kitchen garden and on the north wall and on the ground she had been measuring for drainage. She thought of the miniature, face down on the desk, a life that had been lost and was being kept in the dark, because looking at it was too precise a grief. "I will have Pharaoh bring up the prior year's agricultural accounts in the morning," he said. "There are 2 more discrepancies I want to cross-reference before I write to Greaves." It was a change of subject. It was also an invitation to continue working together. She understood both. The letter to Mr. Dalton went by the Morning Post, bearing both their signatures. November brought the county assembly at Harrington Hall, and Lady Ashmore brought Harriet because it would have been remarked if she had not. She dressed Harriet herself, which was a form of management that Harriet recognized and submitted to without objection, in a gown of dove-gray silk that was suitable and entirely unremarkable, and arranged her hair in a style that was neat and period-appropriate and contrived, Harriet thought, to present her as quietly as possible. She did not object to any of this. She wore the gown. Edmund drove them in the carriage and handed them both down at the assembly rooms with the same attention, which was attention and nothing more. Lady Petworth was standing near the refreshment table with a set of women who had arranged themselves in a particular formation Harriet recognized as social artillery. Lady Petworth was 50, a widow of considerable property and considerable confidence in her own opinions, and she had been, Harriet gathered from Mrs. Pringle's careful silences, a fixture in Edmund's mother's set for 20 years. Lady Petworth greeted Lady Ashmore with genuine warmth. She greeted Harriet with the exact opposite, which was to say a smile that contained the minimum possible content. "Lady Ashmore," she said, with emphasis on the title that made it clear she was acknowledging the fact of it, rather than its substance. "The Carew bride." She tilted her head slightly. "She is the plain twin, is she not? One wonders what Ashmore was thinking." The woman beside Lady Petworth pressed her lips together. A third woman looked at the floor. Harriet looked at Lady Petworth with the same attention she had given the north wall of the kitchen garden. She said quite evenly, "I could not say, my lady. He has not told me." Lady Petworth blinked. It was not the response she had expected, and the calmness of it was, Harriet knew, more unsettling than umbrage would have been. Lady Ashmore made a small sound that was not quite a cough. Harriet moved away to find Edmund, who was speaking with the land agent from the next estate, and stood beside him until he introduced her, and she listened to the conversation about drainage and winter wheat with genuine attention, and asked one question about the fall of the land on the east side of the Harrington property, which she had noticed from the road, and the land agent answered her at length, and with respect. Edmund watched this without appearing to watch. December came cold and clear. A letter arrived from Cecily, who had accepted an offer from Viscount Glenmore and was writing from a state of combined triumph and guilt that expressed itself in a great many words about how Edmund was surely sensible of what a good arrangement this had been for everyone, and how the Viscount had remarked, very kindly, that Edmund had made the quiet choice, which surely suited him, and how she did hope Harriet was not lonely in that large house. The letter was carried in on a silver tray one morning, and by the time it reached Harriet's sitting room, it had been opened. She did not say anything about the fact of its being opened, because she was still new enough to this house not to know whether this was Lady Ashmore's habit or an accident of the post. She read the letter. She set it down on the table beside the ledger, which she had been consulting. She went on with the morning. 2 evenings later, Edmund Stewart Pharaoh was speaking to Mrs. Pringle in the kitchen passage, their voices low, and Harriet was returning a book to the small shelf beside the servant's stair. She stopped when she heard her name. "Her ladyship?" Pharaoh was saying. "She is the plain one, from what they say in the village." A pause, the sound of boots on stone. "Though I'll say she's the first person to have found the Greaves trouble, and Greaves has been here 8 years. She went upstairs. She sat in her sitting room and looked at the ledger and was very grateful to have it, because it meant she did not have to sit with her hands empty. The dinner happened 3 days before Christmas. Lady Ashmore had arranged it as a small affair, herself and Edmund and Harriet, and Lady Petworth and her daughter, and Mr. and Mrs. Fenwick from the nearest estate. 8 in total. The table was set with the good china and the silver that had been polished that week, and the fire in the dining room was built high, and everything was as it should be. The soup was nearly finished when Lady Ashmore produced Cecily's letter. She produced it as one produces evidence, from the pocket at her side, with the deliberate motion of a woman who has been waiting for the right moment. She unfolded it, and said quite pleasantly, "I had a letter from the charming twin, Harriet's sister." She looked around the table. "She writes that her betrothed remarked on Edmund's choice. She calls it the unlovely bargain." Lady Petworth made a sound of polite sympathy. Mrs. Fenwick looked at the tablecloth. Edmund, at the far end of the table, put down his fork. Harriet sat very still. She was good at sitting very still. She had been doing it for 25 years. She looked at the middle distance, and did not look at Edmund, and did not look at Lady Ashmore, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs beneath the table where no one could see them, and she thought about the ledger in her sitting room, which she had corrected and recorrected, and which was now accurate to within a shilling, and she thought about the letter to Mr. Dalton, which bore her name and Edmund's name, and which had resulted in Greaves's departure from the estate the previous week, and she thought about the drainage problem in the kitchen garden, which she had solved, and the pointing in the west wing, which she had arranged, and the household accounts, which now balanced. She was still thinking when the dinner party ended. She went to bed and did not sleep for some time. She lay in the large bed in the east wing and listened to the house settle around her and thought about the figures she had been working on, because that was the one thing she could do with perfect certainty. She could make columns balance. She could find the discrepancy and name it and close it. She could not make Edmund speak. She could not make Lady Ashmore reconsider. She could only be, in the morning, the same person she had been the morning before, which was the only kind of dignity she had ever been able to afford. In the morning she rose before 6 as usual, and dressed and went to the library and opened the ledger and worked. The county assembly at Harrington Hall in January was better attended than the one in November, because the weather had cleared and several families had returned from London, and there was a general mood of relief at the end of the Christmas season. Lady Petworth was there with her usual set. Lady Ashmore attended. Harriet wore the same dove-gray silk, and wore it with the same absence of apology with which she wore everything. Edmund was there, in his dark blue coat and his white cravat, and he had not spoken to Harriet about what had happened at the dinner table, and she had not raised it, because neither of them were people who raised things they could not yet name. She was standing at the edge of the room near the windows, because the room was warm, and the windows were cool, and she found the contrast useful. When Lady Petworth arrived at her side, with the momentum of a woman who has decided to perform a kindness. "Your quiet wife," Lady Petworth said, to no one in particular, and to Edmund, who had come across the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is going, to stand 3 feet from Harriet and a foot from Lady Petworth. "Ashmore, I was just saying to Lady Ashmore how your wife has a gift for quietness." The room had not precisely stopped, but two couples nearby had slowed. Lady Ashmore was watching from 10 feet away. The land agent Harriet had spoken to in November was watching from near the punch bowl. Edmund said, in a voice that carried across the nearest circle of the room, "She runs this estate better than I have in 3 years." The room stopped. Lady Petworth's hand tightened on her fan. Lady Ashmore's expression underwent a complicated interior motion that did not reach her face for several seconds. Edmund turned from Lady Petworth to Harriet, and the turn was deliberate and complete, a physical declaration that could not be mistaken for anything else. He said in the same level voice, "The solicitor writes that the Greaves matter is resolved. Dalton asked that I convey his compliments to you specifically." "That was kind of him," Harriet said. "It was accurate," Edmund said. He paused. Then he said, at a volume the surrounding couples could hear if they chose to listen, and they were choosing, "I married well, Lady Petworth. I only needed a little time to understand it." Lady Petworth said nothing. The land agent turned back to his conversation with the expression of a man successfully pretending he had not heard. Lady Ashmore stood very still. Harriet stood at the edge of the ballroom in her unremarkable gray silk and felt something strange and new. A warmth in the center of her chest that was not triumph and was not relief, but was closer to recognition, the sense of being accurately seen by someone who had bothered to look. Edmund offered her his arm. She took it. They walked together to the far end of the room where the windows overlooked the grounds, and they stood there for a long time without speaking, which was a silence entirely different from all the silences that had come before it. It was a week into the new year when she found the ledger on his desk. She had gone to return a book to the library and had stopped, as she sometimes stopped, to look at the miniature on the corner of the desk. It was face up now. She had noticed this 3 days ago and had said nothing because she was still learning which things to name and which to leave as gestures. She looked at the ledger. He had been working in the agricultural accounts. She could see from the ribbon marking the current page, and she turned to that page and saw his handwriting in the margin, a correction to one of the column totals. He had written the new figure in his careful hand, and then put a line through it. Because the original figure was right. Her figure. She stood at the desk and looked at the crossed-out correction and felt something very warm and very quiet settle in her chest. "I had the wrong multiplier," Edmund said from the doorway. She looked up. He was leaning against the frame in the attitude of a man who has been there for some time. "You were using the old rental rate," she said. "It changed in September. I noted the adjustment on the inner cover." "I found the note," he said, after I had already made the error. She looked back at the crossed-out figure. The line through it was very clean and very definitive, the stroke of a man who acknowledges a mistake without extending it. "The miniature," she said, not looking up. "Yes," he said. She waited. She was good at waiting. He crossed the room. He stood beside her, and they looked at the small oval portrait together, the painted face of a child who had not lived long enough to know either of them. Edmund's hand was beside hers on the desk, not touching. And then it was touching, his fingers overlapping hers by the width of a knuckle. "I have been wrong," he said, "about what I wanted from a marriage. For some time." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, with the focused attention she had seen in the library the morning he found her working, the attention that did not look away. "I am not," she said, "entirely sure what you want from one. Something that does not feel like a country of strangers," he said. His voice was low and very steady. "Something that feels like this room." She understood that. She understood it with the precision of a woman who had lived in the wrong rooms all her life and had learned to make herself useful in them. "I think that is possible," she said. He turned his hand so that it was no longer beside hers but holding hers, carefully and completely, and she let him. And the fire in the library was warm, and outside the window the January fields were pale with frost. He said her name, Harriet, in the voice of a man using a word that had weight in his mouth. And she knew from the way he said it that he had been practicing the sound of it in private. The way you practice a thing you are afraid to lose. She had not expected this. She had not permitted herself to expect it. She thought of Cecily's letter, the phrase, "the unlovely bargain," and felt not the sting of it, but its absurdity, the way it had presumed to measure a thing it had never looked at closely. Edmund Carew had looked closely. He had looked until he understood. She thought that this, finally, was what it felt like to be seen. If you have found your way to this part of the story, then you know what it is to wait for a room to change its mind about you. Leave a word, if you like. Harriet would understand. They did not announce anything. That evening, there was nothing formal to announce. They were already married, after all. Which was a fact the county had decided meant one thing, and which they had quietly decided meant another. Edmund spoke to his mother in the morning, a conversation Harriet was not present for, and Lady Ashmore came to find her afterward in the still room, where Harriet was cataloguing the lavender supply, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the shelves. "I said something unkind," Lady Ashmore said, "when you arrived." Harriet put down the bunch of dried lavender she had been weighing. "Yes," she said. "I did not know you yet," Lady Ashmore said. A pause. "I know you somewhat better now." Another pause. "The Greaves matter was well handled." "The ledger made it plain," Harriet said. "Yes," Lady Ashmore said, in the tone of a woman who understands that she is being let off more gently than she deserves, and knows it, and is grateful for it, and is too proud to say so. "I expect it did." She went away. Harriet looked at the lavender and thought that this was the shape of things, not a world remade, but a room slowly admitting more light. It was enough. It was more than she had expected. Spring came to Ashmore with the particular extravagance of a late winter breaking, all at once, so that the kitchen garden went from frost to pale green in a fortnight, and the kitchen garden drainage, now properly addressed, carried the meltwater away cleanly and without incident. Harriet watched it from the north wall and felt a quiet satisfaction that was not pride, exactly, but something adjacent to it, the sense of a problem correctly solved. Edmund came to stand beside her. He had been out with the tenant farmers since early morning, and he smelled of cold air and turned earth, and she had become, without meaning to, the kind of person who noticed what he smelled like. "Pharaoh says the home farm yields are up from last year," he said. "The drainage accounts for part of it," she said. "The new rotation the tenant on the east field is trying may account for more, if the summer is dry enough." He looked at her. "You spoke to him about the rotation." "He mentioned it in passing. I suggested he might try it on the smaller field first to test the yield." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was not preparing to speak, but was simply being present, a quality she had learned to recognize and had come to value more than she had words for. "I should like," he said, "to put your name on the household accounts formally. Not as a courtesy, as an authority." She turned to look at him. The morning light was thin and clear, and it fell across his face in the way it fell across the fields, without preference, illuminating what was there. "I already manage the household accounts," she said. "I know," he said. "I should like everyone else to know it." He paused. "You have been doing the work of this estate since October, without the name for it. I would like to correct that." She thought of the ledger on the desk, the crossed-out figure, the clean line through it. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." He put his hand briefly over hers, where it rested on the wall, and they stood together looking at the kitchen garden, which was green and precisely drained, and quietly proving something that Harriet had suspected since September, that a thing correctly managed from the beginning will flourish, given only time and sufficient attention. The ledger was on his desk when she went to the library that afternoon. He had added a line to the inner cover in his careful hand, below her September notation about the rental rate adjustment. He had written, "All corrections gratefully received. H.C., January 1817. It was not, perhaps, what another man would have written. It was the truest thing she had received in her life. She sat down at the table under the north windows, the one that got the morning light, the one she had claimed without being given it. She opened the ledger. The miniature stood at the corner of the desk, face up, a small portrait of a child who had not had the chance to know either of them, held now in the light. Outside, the kitchen garden was green. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, Harriet thought, exactly as much as she had refused to stop believing in. Through every morning she had risen before the household was awake, and every column of figures she had corrected, and every problem she had solved for a room that had not yet learned to look. Edmund Carew had looked. He had looked until he understood what he saw. And what he saw had changed him in the way that true understanding always changes a person. Not suddenly, but completely. She turned to the next page of the ledger and began. "Thank you for staying until the end of Harriet's story. If her quiet work in that house moved you, leave a word in the comments. She would not have asked for it. That is, perhaps, why it matters most.